It is time now for Reporters Roundtable to put the headlines in perspective. Bud Ross and Bernadine, Channel 8's political producer, are with us every Sunday. And Ross, will start with you. President Trump in town tomorrow in Houston at the Toyota Center down there. Is he helping Republicans or motivating Democrats?
I think he's probably doing both, but the Republicans wouldn't have him down here if he wasn't helping them more, or if they didn't think he was helping them more. You're trying to excite your own voters without inciting the other team's voters. And, you know, where Trump has gone around the country in the past has seemed to be helpful to Republican candidates.
And, Bud, they started at a smaller venue, and they moved up to the Toyota Center, the NBA and NHL arena there.
Right. They started the barn where they have horse shows, and now they've moved up. That, you know, shows everybody that he's building momentum. But, you know, what Trump is coming for and what they're going to stress is this immigration theme that they've been hitting on. That's what's working with voters. They keep talking about open borders. Democrats are for open borders. You know, the fear of Hondurans coming to the border. You cruise with the Border Patrol Friday in Fort Worth. Everybody wants to talk about borders and immigration. That's what Trump will talk about in Houston.
Bernadine, you have that skeptical look on your face as you listen to Bud.
Well, no, actually, this is one time I agree with him. But also during the debate, one of the biggest topics that got a lot of response was about health care, which the Republicans are not necessarily a plus on that. However, I think that you're correct that he's coming down to motivate both. But what party wants a candidate that's going to motivate the opposite campaign? But he probably will help Cruz as well.
Yeah, and Ross, you bring up a good point. He wouldn't be coming down here if he was going to be harming Republicans, really. But how does he motivate Democrats?
Well, you know, Democrats dislike him as much as Republicans like him. When you look at the poll, they just separate. You know, you can see what happens with an endorsement. When we asked Beto O'Rourke if he was going to have Obama down to endorse him, and he said, no, I don't think so. And clearly part of the calculation there is Obama might excite more Republicans to the polls than Democrats, and best just to leave it alone.
And this reinforces Cruz's strongest point about Beto. The first thing Cruz always says about Beto O'Rourke is he's going to impeach Donald Trump. Beto, you repeated that on CNN. And
Bernadine, let's talk about the final debate in San Antonio between Beto and Cruz. Who benefits now 5-6 days later? Is anyone really getting any traction off that?
I think both of them are, because again, they were talking to their base. And regardless of how President Trump will motivate his base or motivate the Democrats, they still need to get their voters to the polls. It's all about turnout.
It is all about turnout, Ross, too. And you know, there are a lot of undecideds in this race here, too. Does Beto have a chance to get these undercounted millennials and younger folks to the polls?
Yeah, the question here is whether, you know, Cruz's voters are sufficiently excited. You know, he keeps talking about complacency being a problem. Will the Republicans show up? And the problem for O'Rourke is, can he get voters who don't normally vote in midterm elections, whether they're presidential year voters or whether they're new voters, to show up in sufficient numbers? He's got to cover about 1.5 million votes to make it work.
Well, and then also he needs to get the young voters who appear to be excited to the polls. Just because they're registering to vote, just because that enthusiasm is there, that does not mean, if you look at history, that they're going to the polls.
If regular voters turn out, only regular voters, then Cruz will win. Beto O'Rourke's only path to victory is to increase the voter turnout by about 10%. If it gets up 44, 45%, Beto O'Rourke will win.
And Ross, Beto has already apologized for saying, calling Ted Cruz lying Ted in that San Antonio debate. Honestly, being in that room, I expected a little more of a slugfest, considering he's behind, and we're, what, 2 weeks out now.
But you know
he had some good lines, but he didn't really land a punch on him. Yeah. And, you know, I think that was sort of like the battle between Beto and Beto. One of them wants to be a regular politician, like he was in his first race for Congress, and one of them wants to be, you know, the nice guy who's running away from politics as usual. And, you know, you kind of saw the conflict right on his face there.
Jason, that tough talk didn't look good on Beto. He looked like he was uncomfortable. It looked like a third grader who didn't want to fight another boy but had to fight it.
All right, guys, we are out of time. Thank you very much. We appreciate it, and thank you for watching as well. ABC's This Week begins in just a moment right here on Channel 8. We'll see you again next Sunday.